Ask yourself something. When was the last time you saw a country cancel its own army? Not postpone a parade, not scale it back due to weather. Actually cancel the physical appearance of its military on the one day of the year that military is supposed to be seen. That is what Russia did on May 9th, 2026, in Red Square in front of the entire world. And almost nobody is telling you what that actually means. The mainstream media ran the footage of soldiers marching, talked about diplomatic tensions, and moved on to the next story. But what happened in Moscow last weekend is not a diplomatic footnote. It is a confession. And once you understand what was confessed and why, you will never look at this war the same way again. Here is what nobody is telling you. Russia's Victory Day parade, the single most watched military spectacle in the Russian calendar, the event Putin uses every year to remind NATO and the world that Russia is a force to be reckoned with, featured no tanks, no jets, no missiles, and no military hardware of any kind rolling across the cobblestones of Red Square. Instead, the Russian government played a video, a screen, a slideshow of weapons that were not there. And the reason they were not there is not logistical. It is not a scheduling conflict. Those weapons are gone. That is the hidden mechanism this video is going to expose, not the parade, the absence. Because what is missing from a military parade tells you infinitely more than what is present. Let us start with the number I want you to hold in your head for the next 15 minutes, 1%. In 4 full years of war, 4 years of casualties, sanctions, economic sacrifice, international isolation, and the systematic destruction of an entire generation of young Russian men, Russia has gained approximately 1% of additional Ukrainian territory beyond what it already controlled at the end of 2022. 1%. The source is open source battlefield tracking, satellite confirmation, and Ukrainian military reporting cross-referenced with Western intelligence assessments. This is not propaganda. This is the arithmetic of a war machine that has been grinding itself to dust in exchange for almost nothing. That number destroys the central narrative that Russia has been selling its own population for 4 years, that this is a special military operation that is going according to plan, that victory is coming, that the sacrifice is worth it. 1% is not a plan. 1% is a catastrophe dressed up in military pageantry. And the media does not lead with this number because leading with it would require explaining everything that comes after it. And everything that comes after it is deeply uncomfortable for governments and institutions that spent years underestimating Ukraine and overestimating Russia. So let us go through what actually happened in order, because the sequence matters. Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, expecting the government in Kyiv to collapse within days. It did not. Russia expected NATO to fracture under the pressure of an energy crisis. It did not. Russia expected the Ukrainian population to accept occupation. It did not. What followed instead was 4 years of grinding, brutal, attritional warfare that has cost Russia, by Ukraine's confirmed and documented count, more than 11,000 tanks, over 24,000 armored fighting vehicles, more than 400 aircraft, and over 300 helicopters. These are verified losses, not estimates, not propaganda, documented through satellite imagery, open source intelligence, and on-the-ground confirmation by journalists and analysts with no interest in inflating numbers. And what did Russia buy with all of that destruction? 1% of territory and a parade with no tanks. Now let us talk about the 6 words everyone is reporting on, but almost nobody is actually explaining. After the Victory Day parade ended on May 9th, Vladimir Putin stood in front of reporters and said, "I think the matter is coming to an end." Within hours, headlines around the world were suggesting Putin had signaled readiness for peace. Analysts were cautioning against optimism. Diplomats were hedging. And millions of ordinary people watching the news were asking the same question: does this mean it is actually over? The honest answer is that those 6 words were designed to be everything to everyone, and that ambiguity is entirely the point. Here is the surface explanation. Putin is saying Russia is winning and Ukraine is about to collapse. This is how the Kremlin wants you to read it. And Putin has never publicly admitted Russia is losing. He is not about to start. But here is the first layer underneath that surface. Putin's approval rating, which his entire political legitimacy depends on, has dropped significantly. It stood above 80% before the invasion. Earlier this year, polling including surveys from Russia's own state-affiliated organizations showed it had fallen to 65%. For a leader whose hold on power is built entirely on the image of strength, popularity, and control, this is not a statistic, it is a warning sign. And here is the deeper layer. A senior Russian Communist Party figure, not a fringe opposition voice, but the longtime leader of Russia's second largest political party, stood in the Russian parliament earlier this year and warned that if urgent economic and financial measures were not taken, Russia could face a repeat of the 1917 revolution by autumn. He invoked the Bolshevik Revolution in parliament, in Russia. That is not someone complaining about a bad quarter. That is someone describing a country that is losing cohesion. A senior Russian official speaking anonymously to a major Western newspaper said, and I want you to hear this, that the overall mood is that enough is enough, that the war has gone on longer than World War II, and that Russia has not even managed to fully take control of a single one of the regions it claimed to have annexed. The Kremlin is not preparing for victory. It is preparing a story about victory. The leaked document published by a former Russian oligarch who was jailed by Putin for a decade and now operates in exile reportedly outlines how Putin can convince the Russian people that they won the war even if the war ends right now, without Russia having achieved a single one of its stated objectives. The Kremlin, according to this document, is working on a manufactured narrative, a way to package failure as triumph, a way to give Putin an exit door without making him walk through it in public. That is what the matter is coming to an end actually means. It is not a peace signal, it is a pressure valve, a message to Russian elites, Russian business people, Russian mothers, that Putin hears the exhaustion, that he is looking for the door. But he will not take any door he cannot frame as a victory. And the bind Russia is in is that no available exit door looks like a victory. Think about it this way. Imagine you spent 4 years renovating a house. You told everyone it would take 3 weeks. You borrowed enormous sums of money. You brought in hundreds of workers, many of whom did not come home. And after 4 years, you have repainted one wall out of the entire house. And now you need to explain to everyone who lent you money, everyone who lost a family member, everyone who believed you, why the renovation is not finished and why the house looks worse than when you started. That is the position Putin is in. The house is Russia's geopolitical ambition. The renovation is the war. The one repainted wall is 1% of Ukrainian territory. And the people waiting outside for an update are 300,000 Russian families who have already received the worst update possible. Now let us talk about money, because Russia's economic situation in 2026 has a name. A former Russian central bank advisor writing for a major international publication used the mountaineering term death zone to describe it. In mountaineering, the death zone is the altitude above which the human body consumes itself faster than it can recover. You are still moving, you are still breathing, but the damage accumulates faster than healing is possible, and eventually the math catches up. Russia's GDP grew at 4.3% in 2024. By 2025, that had collapsed to 1%, a decline of over 75% in a single year. For 2026, the International Monetary Fund projects growth of under 1%, and a Kremlin-linked think tank has warned of a high probability of outright recession, meaning negative growth, as early as July of this year. Putin himself acknowledged in a rare moment of public candor that Russia's GDP contracted in the first 2 months of 2026. This is the man who spent years telling his people that Western sanctions were ineffective, that Russia's economy was resilient, that the pain was manageable. And now his own numbers tell a different story. Russia is spending between 38% and 40% of its entire federal budget on defense and security. To fund that, it has raised the value-added tax, increased business taxes, introduced tariffs on electronics and consumer goods, and is effectively confiscating civilian economic activity to feed the war machine. Food prices are up over 20%. Services are up 14%, fuel costs have risen 11%, partly because Ukraine has been systematically destroying Russian oil processing infrastructure using long-range drones. Interest rates are being held at punishing levels around 14 to 16% to try to contain inflation. This strangles business investment, kills consumer lending, and makes normal economic activity increasingly impossible. Russia's sovereign wealth fund, the rainy day reserve that was supposed to protect the country through exactly this kind of shock, has been drained from around 6% of GDP in 2021 to below 2% today. Russia is spending its savings. Its oil revenues, once the backbone of federal financing, fell by 24% in 2025 to just over $111 billion. Russian crude is currently selling at roughly $29 below global benchmark prices because of sanctions on its shipping and banking systems. And then there is the labor crisis that nobody is talking about enough. Russia does not have enough workers. Hundreds of thousands of working-age men have been pulled into the military or killed. Hundreds of thousands more are permanently disabled. Hundreds of thousands more fled the country after the 2022 mobilization announcement and have not returned. The result is a labor market so tight that military-related wages are being bid up while civilian industries collapse from the inside. Companies are closing. Restaurants are shutting. Workers across sectors are going unpaid. A Moscow business executive quoted in a major Western newspaper estimated a financial crisis could arrive within 3 to 4 months. A Kremlin-linked banking analysis found that problem assets in the banking sector have exceeded 10% of total holdings, which by International Monetary Fund standards officially constitutes a systemic banking crisis. Small and medium business loans are the hardest hit, with nearly 20% classified as problematic. The regional picture is even bleaker. Across Russia, local governments are cutting education and healthcare spending to balance books, redirecting whatever remains toward a war that is consuming the country's future. And here is what is not an anecdote, it is a structural reality. Russia built its economy for this war. The surge in military production that generated artificial GDP growth in 2023 and 2024 is now the source of its greatest vulnerability. All that military spending created inflation, drained civilian capacity, and generated a debt load that Russia will be managing for years, whether the war ends or not. Russia is in the death zone, still moving, still functioning, but consuming itself faster than it can recover. Now, here is the part of this story that mainstream coverage consistently gets wrong. While Russia has been hollowing out its economy and burning through its pre-war military stockpiles, Ukraine has been doing something that no one in 2022 thought was possible. Ukraine has become the world's most advanced real-time laboratory for drone warfare, artificial intelligence in combat, and autonomous weapon systems. And the gap between what Ukraine is deploying on the battlefield and what Russia can counter is growing, not shrinking. In March 2026 alone, Russian forces lost nearly 36,000 troops. And here is the number that should stop you completely. Drones accounted for 90% of confirmed Russian combat losses in that month. 90%. This is not a future weapon. This is not experimental technology being tested in controlled conditions. This is the dominant killing technology of this war right now today. Ukraine is on track to produce approximately 7 million drones in 2026 aerial, ground, and maritime systems. In just the first quarter of this year, procurement of high-quality drones and robotic platforms exceeded the total for all of the previous year. Ukraine has deployed AI-powered defense turrets that autonomously detect and track incoming drones, including fiber-optic drones that are entirely immune to electronic jamming. The human operator's role in these systems is reduced to a single confirmation button. Detection, tracking, targeting, all handled by artificial intelligence. There are currently 10 of these systems confirmed in active combat deployment, with more being produced. Ukraine has developed fiber-optic drones that communicate through a physical cable rather than radio signals, making them invisible to the sophisticated jamming systems Russia spent years and billions developing. Russia has no effective countermeasure for them, none. Ukraine has deployed a drone carrier, a ground-based vehicle that moves the launch point for these fiber-optic drones 10, 15, even 20 kilometers closer to Russian positions, solving the range limitation while keeping human operators safely behind the line. In April 2026, Ukraine destroyed approximately 30 Russian air defense systems in a single month. In the first 8 days of May alone, 10 more. These are not replaceable on short timelines. As they are destroyed and not replenished fast enough, more and more of Russia's territory, its oil refineries, its military headquarters, its cities becomes reachable by Ukrainian long-range drone strikes. Ukraine already demonstrated this. The Yaroslav refinery north of Moscow has been struck. The Perm refinery and pumping station, located 1,500 kilometers from Ukraine's border, has been hit multiple times in recent weeks alone, with 6 massive storage tanks destroyed. This is a deliberate strategic campaign targeting Russia's revenue stream at the source. Russia attempted to answer with its own AI-powered strike drone, which its defense industry promoted with great fanfare as an unmatched system. Ukraine shot it down on its first operational encounter. The recovered drone was sent to Ukrainian specialists for analysis, and the result of all this on the ground? In the first quarter of 2026, Russia lost more troops than it managed to recruit. That is a net negative. Russia is offering enormous signing bonuses, debt forgiveness, and university admission perks to attract soldiers, and still cannot fill the gap. The math is no longer moving in Russia's favor. Now let's talk about what actually happened around the ceasefire, because this moment tells you everything about where the diplomacy really stands. On May 8th, the United States announced a 3-day ceasefire to coincide with Russia's Victory Day celebrations. A prisoner exchange was agreed. 1,000 Russian prisoners returned to Russia. 1,000 Ukrainian prisoners returned to Ukraine. Ukraine accepted. Ukraine's coordination headquarters submitted the list. American mediation was confirmed. The arrangement was publicly announced by the President of the United States. Within less than 24 hours, Russia struck an apartment building in Kharkiv. Drones and missiles hit across 6 Ukrainian regions. 3 people were killed in strikes near the front line. Over 200 battlefield clashes were recorded on the second day of the supposed ceasefire. People died in drone attacks in the Zaporizhia, Dnipropetrovsk, and Kherson regions, while the ceasefire was nominally in effect. Then Putin emerged and told reporters that Ukraine had made clear it was not ready for a prisoner exchange and that no proposals had been received from Ukraine. This was false. The list had been submitted. America had confirmed. The President of the United States had publicly announced the deal, and Putin simply denied it existed. Zelensky went public. He noted that the Americans had assumed responsibility for guaranteeing the arrangement. He called on the American side to play an active role in ensuring it was fulfilled. The question that remained unanswered, and is still unanswered, is whether the United States would respond to Russia breaking its word or let it pass as it had before. This pattern has become entirely predictable. Russia announces or agrees to a ceasefire. Russia continues attacking during the ceasefire. Russia then accuses Ukraine of violations to justify its own continued attacks. The diplomatic community goes through the motions and nothing changes. The United States Secretary of State, speaking just days before Victory Day, publicly admitted that American-led peace mediation has produced nothing. After more than a year of shuttle diplomacy, back-channel negotiations, and public declarations of progress, he stood up and said it had not led to a fruitful outcome and that the United States did not want to waste its time and energy on an effort that was not moving forward. Think about what that admission means. The most powerful country in the world spent over a year trying to broker an end to this war and has nothing to show for it. The reason, though few officials will say it plainly, is structurally simple. Ukraine will not surrender internationally recognized Ukrainian territory. And Russia cannot agree to stop this war because stopping it on any terms available means admitting even implicitly that the objectives of the invasion were never achieved. Putin cannot go home and say, we launched a war that killed hundreds of thousands of our own soldiers, destroyed our economy, isolated Russia from the world, and we got nothing. So the war continues, even as every pressure on Russia intensifies simultaneously. There is one moment from this past week that deserves its own place in this story because it was a masterpiece of strategic communication. Ukraine's president issued a formal presidential decree with official formatting, official stamps, the full apparatus of state authority granting Russia permission to hold its Victory Day parade. The decree included the precise GPS coordinates of Red Square. It declared the area temporarily off-limits for Ukrainian strikes, and it framed this as a generous concession, allowing Russia its symbolic celebration. The Kremlin dismissed it as a joke, but the message was received by everyone watching. Ukraine is not afraid. Ukraine is not begging for peace. Ukraine has the capability, and at this moment, Ukraine is choosing to allow Russia its one symbolic day. That is a very different sentence from the one Putin wanted the world to hear on May 9th, 2026. Let us put all of this together, because when you hold the full picture, it is unmistakable. Russia is not winning this war. After 4 years, after an expenditure of blood and resources that should be unthinkable in the 21st century, Russia controls approximately the same amount of Ukrainian territory it held in late 2022, having added roughly 1% more through 4 years of grinding attrition. The Ukrainian government has not fallen. NATO has not collapsed. Ukraine has not surrendered. Russia, by contrast, has consumed its pre-war military stockpile. It has burned through its sovereign wealth fund. It has demographically damaged itself for a generation through casualties and emigration. It has destroyed its international reputation. It has built an alliance of last resort with North Korea, the only foreign military that marched alongside Russian soldiers at this year's Victory Day parade, while China watched carefully from the sidelines without sending so much as a meaningful delegation. And within Kremlin circles, leaked documents suggest that Putin's advisors are actively working out how to sell a non-victory as a victory, so that Putin can end the war without triggering the domestic political collapse that an honest accounting of this war would produce. There are reports of Putin being willing to negotiate with Europe, with his preferred intermediary being a former German chancellor who has remained personally close to him for decades. Putin has said publicly for the first time that he would be willing to meet Ukraine's president, but only outside Russia and only after a comprehensive peace treaty is already finalized, which means never in practice. Zelensky has been willing to meet Putin anywhere except Russia or Belarus for over a year. He traveled to Turkey when it was suggested Putin might appear. Putin did not show up. The pattern is consistent. Russia creates the appearance of openness while ensuring that actual negotiations cannot occur, because actual negotiations would require Russia to acknowledge in some form what it has and has not achieved. And that acknowledgement is, for now, the one thing Putin cannot afford. There was one genuinely hopeful signal this week, and it came from a somewhat unexpected place. Hungary swore in a new prime minister, replacing the leader who had been one of Putin's most reliable advocates within the European Union for over a decade. Within hours of the inauguration ceremony, the European Union flag was back on the balcony of the Hungarian Parliament building, where it had been removed years earlier as a symbolic act of defiance against Brussels. Europe is recalibrating. The assumption that cheap Russian energy, cheap Chinese goods, and cheap American security could be the permanent foundation of European prosperity is now officially over. Europe is building its own defense capacity and its own political identity, and the departure of one of Putin's most loyal European allies is a meaningful step in that direction. So here is the question I want to leave you with. When Putin says the matter is coming to an end, he may be right, but ask yourself, coming to an end for whom, on whose terms, producing what kind of world? Because if this war is ending, it is not ending the way Putin told his people it would when he sent his forces into Ukraine in February 2022. It is not ending in 3 days or 3 weeks or with a change of government in Kiev. It is ending with Russia having burned through an almost incomprehensible amount of its own strength, its own future, and its own people in exchange for 1% of territory and a Victory Day parade with no tanks. The crutch battalions, the columns of young Russian veterans marching through the small towns of Russia on May 9th on crutches in wheelchairs with prosthetic limbs, are not the parades of a country that is winning. They are the parades of a country that is finally beginning to understand the true price of what it started. And the number I want to leave you with, the one that summarizes everything, is not the tanks destroyed or the drones produced or the percentage of budget spent on war. It is 1%. 1% of territory, after 4 years, after everything. That is the number that explains why there were no tanks in Red Square. That is the number that explains what Putin means when he says the matter is coming to an end. That is the number that historians will use decades from now when they write about the moment a nuclear power discovered that raw force is no longer enough to bend a determined people to its will. The 21st century is not one with tanks. It is one with the people willing to face them.